Welcome to the 10th Roy Palmer lecture. Roy died in February 2015 and the lecture series was commenced in the following year. So this is the 10th and our speaker this afternoon, is Jon Boden. Jon is of course well known to you as a performer. His work with John Spears, with Bellowhead and more recently the Remnant Kings. And he produced the remarkable online collection A Folk Song a Day, for which he researched and sang 365 traditional songs. Must have been a busy time. He studied medieval history and literature at Durham University and has since been awarded honorary doctorates by Durham and by the Open University. And his lecture today is The Folk Revival, A View from the Middle. So, please welcome Jon Boden.
Thank you very much. I feel like I ought to start with a couple of disclaimers. One is that, one's more an apology. I'm going to be talking about age quite a lot, which is sometimes a delicate issue. But we're talking about the future of the folk revival, and so we're talking about young people getting into the folk revival. So if we're talking about their age, then I think we have to talk about our age as well. So just to start off, and Martin, when he asked me to do this lecture, he was kind enough to say that they were hoping to get someone who spoke more to young people, which is a lovely compliment, and I think there is certainly I think my band Bellowhead have been quite good at bringing some younger people into the scene. But one caveat I need to make is that I am 48 years old, ladies and gentlemen. I am 2 years older than the Chancellor of the Exchequer. I am not here as a young person. I want to make that very clear. I'm here as someone in the middle. So my kids are 16 and 19, so about the age, and very. So I'm sort of 30 years older than the people who are just starting off in the folk scene, but also sort of 30 years younger than the people who have been doing it since the 60s. So that's why it's called The View from the Middle. And also, one caveat, I'm sort of going to be talking, the bit about, in that I know about, is the middle, right? I know about my experience of it, and I will talk about that. And I know less about what was happening in 1965 than what was happening in 2001. I also know less about what's happening now than I know about what happened in 2001, because I'm not a young person. Okay, so there's an element of observation and anecdote in this talk that you'll have to forgive me for. That being said, let's crack on. So I'm going to start off with 1965. I wasn't around at the time. Some of you were. So this is what I'm talking about with ages. Now, I hope Martin won't mind me talking about it. It is a matter of public record how old Martin Carthy is. So this is Martin, age 24. Okay. At the same point, Bert Lloyd was 57. And Sam Larnon was 86. Okay, so that's the sort of dynamic we've got in 1965. If we jump on to 2001, there's me, age 24. There's Martin at that point, age 60. And Fred Jordan was 80 at that point. So those of you who remember Fred Jordan, that's a bit of context. So, and then if we jump on to today, so I'm going to be talking about Seb a bit. I don't think Seb's here. Oh, hello, Seb. Where are you? Okay. So, well, Seb can talk about himself then. I don't need to talk about. Anyway, Seb is my source for some of the information about the younger folk scene as it is now, and also Seb. This is Seb, age 24. So that hence the symmetry of the three things. So I'm going to talk about Seb a bit later on. But there's Seb, age 24. There's me, last year. And there's Martin now. Round of applause for Martin Carthy. So this is where my knowledge is not spectacular, but my understanding of 1965 is there were about 300 folk clubs by that point, or around that point. It was a massive thing, the folk club boom. You could one of the things people always say is you could go on tour in Manchester. You could do a whole week tour of Manchester around the folk clubs, you know. So what else was there in 1965 for a 24-year-old Martin Carthy starting off? There were the folk clubs. Topic Records had just had a big success with the Iron Muse, so they had lots of money, basically, or relatively speaking, and so they were starting to bring out lots of recordings. The radio ballads had just been out. Sidmouth and Cambridge folk festivals had started. I don't know about other ones. I think maybe there are a couple of other ones, but there, yeah.
66.
Okay, all right. So, but there were not a lot of folk festivals basically, but they were getting started, getting underway. Folk was on mainstream television. We got the Travelling for a Living documentary with the Watersons, for example, but also just lots of little. There seems to be lots of little reports on mainstream news when you sort of YouTube it. There's lots of it was in the popular culture. People were aware of it. And Dylan had just gone electric, which I think is significant because that to me feels like from that point on, it's sort of folk rock becomes almost inevitable. That's from my perspective. I don't know if that's true, but there's a sense that it's all leading up to folk rock. So the thing that I think is crucial to this talk is actually the fact that was a social movement, that it was initiated, it was organised by, it was performed by, and to 20-somethings, people in their 20s. And people would go to folk clubs not because they had a sort of huge academic interest in 19th and 18th century folk song. They went because that's what the other 20-year-olds are doing. Yeah? And for me, that's where it all comes from. Everything, Whitby Folk Week, all of us here, we all actually come from that social movement that was the folk clubs in the 60s, and it was a youth movement, and it was primarily a social movement. And I think everything else has sort of come out of that. So we're going to sort of talk about that more as we go along. Yes, then we got 5 years later, folk rock kicks off, and that's like it then goes into overdrive, because then folk music, English folk music particularly, becomes part of the mainstream. You've got Sandy Denny on the biggest rock album ever, Zeppelin 4. It's all, everyone's rubbing shoulders with pop stars. It's you've got Steel Eye Span in the top 10, all this sort of stuff. So that's sort of about to kick off for Martin when he's 24. And just one thought I had is that Martin actually, when you get to say 1969, Martin was then in his late 20s, so a lot of people coming in at that point would have been in their early 20s. So for Martin, I imagine it for his whole career, it's been quite common for him to be sort of the oldest person in the room, one of the oldest people in the room, which is just sort of a thought that I had when I was putting this together. So we jump forward to 2001, and what infrastructure was there supporting me in 2001, starting out? There's not really any clear statistics on this, but my guess is there's about 150 folk clubs in 2001, maybe more. I mean, it's difficult because some things are called folk clubs that we don't think of. I used to go to the Durham Folk Club, which was a singing session. There are lots of folk clubs that don't book acts. They do their own thing. So, but in terms of as a performer, I'd say there are about 150 that were booking. So still, that's a lot. That's a big resource for someone new coming into it. Loads and loads of folk festivals, about 300 apparently, and it certainly felt like that at the time. Topic Records was kind of at it, it just kept growing. I think Topic Records is my perception of it from that sort of 65 onwards. It just kept growing and kept getting bigger, and it was still there. They wouldn't sign me, but they were signing lots of other people, but also Fellside, who did sign me, and Wild Goose and various other sort of very English folk specialist labels were there as sort of infrastructure. Very importantly, the Folk Awards had just kind of got going. F Roots, which was the it grew out of Southern Rag, yes. But certainly when I was starting off, and for most of my sort of most of my career, that has been the magazine that was the sort of emblematic magazine of the scene, you know, and that was there. And so for me, starting off, you know, so I came into the folk scene from the outside. I didn't grow up in the folk scene. I got into folk music by listening to Led Zeppelin, primarily, you know, first of all, as a teenager. And then someone gave me a Martin Carthy bootleg tape, you know, and then I sort of discovered my parents' record collection. They had a few, you know, folk records in there. So, you know, it was that sort of process. So I didn't know anything about the folk scene. And I didn't really have any conception of making a living performing in the folk scene. But I did go along to a folk club, I guess when I was about 22, and they offered me a gig. And at the time, I was like, oh, right, okay, this is how it works then. You go and do a folk club, and then they offer you a gig. Great. So you know, so I just sort of, oh, great, yeah, I'll do that, you know. And around the same time, John Spires and I bumped into each other in a session. And similarly, his folk club in Cambridge, or the one he had been to when he was at university, they offered him a gig, and so we were just sort of putting stuff together, and he was like, "Oh yeah, I've been offered a gig, yeah." And I was like, "Oh yeah, I've been offered a gig too, yeah." So, and that's an incredible impetus to get going. You know, if you get someone saying, "Would you like to come and perform 2 45-minute sets at our folk club? We will give you some money." It's amazing, really, looking back. And I think at the time, I just like, "Oh yeah, do that," you know. Similarly, folk festivals. Sidmouth Folk Festival booked me and John, I think, off the back of an email from John to begin with, and gave us free tickets, and we went and did a showcase, and then they booked us for the next year. You know, that was massive. And then the Folk Awards, you know, we got a kind of newcomer thing a few years into starting, and F Fruits similarly very, very supportive. So just very, very supportive infrastructure. That's what I'm saying basically. 2001, I didn't appreciate it at the time, as I say, but looking back on it, incredibly supportive infrastructure. But it wasn't a youth movement. So it was all organised by the same people who were organising it in 1965, yeah, so there were young people around, and I remember the first time I went to Sidmouth going, where are all these young people coming from? This is amazing, because my experience up to that point had just been singing at the Sing Around in Durham, I'm still known as Student John in Durham. That's my, because I was the youngest by about 20 years at that session. So there were young people around, but they were all people who were kids of people who had got into folk music in the 60s, or primarily that. And when we started off, all these gigs, it was fantastic, supportive infrastructure, as I say, but it was extremely common for me and John to be playing to an average age audience of 30 years above our own age when we were starting off, you know. And then this point at the bottom about there being a strong gravitational pull. So as I say, I didn't get into folk music to be part of the folk scene. I got into it because I liked the music and I wanted to go and, you know, sing somewhere. And there was this sort of ready-made infrastructure for me. So there was a very strong gravitational pull for me to go. And I loved it, and I still love it. And you know, people can be quite rude about the folk scene. I think it's amazing. I think it's a brilliant, wonderful, supportive, it's kind of miraculous thing, the folk scene, when you think about it. I can't think of any other event, you know, movement in history that has taken an art form that's more or less died and brought it back and turned it into a mass movement that has then lasted for 60 years. You know, I mean, it's an extraordinary thing, and I think we should celebrate it. So I don't mean this in any way disparaging to the folk scene, but there is a sense where that gravitational force meant that there was never really any likelihood that I was going to get a bunch of 20-year-olds together and say, let's go and hang out at this thing, and let's do this thing, and it'll be our thing, you know, and we're going to do this weird thing called folk music, you know, because there was already this thing, this big thing over here that was this strong gravitational pull. As I say, fantastic, and I was very grateful for that. I just sort of flagging that up now. So how did it support me? How did the 60s revival support me? there was a ready-made community of like-minded folk enthusiasts. So very much when I went to the coal pits in Durham, I felt like I'd found my place, you know, even though everyone in the room, well, not everyone, most people in the room were 30 years older than me. It felt very much at home because everyone had the same interests, and it was great. Huge amount of encouragement, enthusiasm, employment, being given money is always nice. Record deal, not in the sense of being thrown money at, but just having a record label go, yes, we will make this record and we put it out and you will have a record to sell, you know, which is a huge incentive to get stuff done. The performance model, I think, is something that we don't really think about so much in the folk scene, but I think it's a huge part of the folk scene, how people perform on stage. There's a very strong culture of it. And it borrows stuff from other scenes, and that has lots in common with other scenes. But it's very much its own thing. The way, for example, it is assumed that if you're going to sing, do a 90-minute set, you will probably spend 20 minutes of that talking, and ideally saying funny stuff. You know, there's a lot of a lot of careers in the folk scene are actually about how funny people are, or at least as much about how funny people are. And that's you don't get that in the classical music scene, you don't get that in the jazz scene, certainly don't get that in the rock and pop scene, you know. People will say funny things, but, you know, it will be a little throwaway remark halfway through, apart from people like Lewis Capaldi or whatever, who actually would fit in quite well in the folk scene. Anyway, the performance model, the stagecraft. I remember the first time we did a gig, and Paul and Linda from Fellside came, and they were furious with me and John because we weren't selling CDs in the interval. And we're like, well, I didn't know how to do that. You know, and so now every gig since then, I've always sold CDs in the interval. You know, so it's stuff like that, and getting mailing lists and all that sort of thing. There's a lot of just models for how to do it, you know, that are there that we learn from. Advice, not always welcome, but generally helpful. So there was very much a sense in the early noughties as a young person then performing at folk clubs that the people who've been doing it for 30 years or more often did feel that they could come and give you advice, you know, and as I say, it was normally very useful advice, but it's not necessarily what you want to hear all the time, you know. I remember the first time I performed a floor spot, which was at the Oxford Folk Club, and I'd been practicing fiddle singing. I hadn't done much fiddle singing, so I did this, and I've been working on it. And I'm going to go and do it. You know, I knew that you could go and do floor sports at this place, so I did it. And the MC sort of, I thought I'd done rather well, you know, sort of finished. And then the MC said, "Oh, it's very good. You just need to learn to do it with your eyes open, and you'll be right." You know, which was not what I wanted to hear. On the other hand, ever since then, I've consciously tried to keep my eyes open. So you know, and stuff like that, and people saying, "Oh, you know, you need to sing louder, you need to finish your words properly, enunciate, all that sort of stuff." People felt they could tell me that, you know, and that was the sort of the quid pro quo of people going, you know, come and do a gig, you know, which was great. But then also, I think understandably, there was a sense that people could then come tell, you know, give you a constructive criticism, which was really, really useful. The reason I sort of am saying that in slightly equivocal terms is I think it could have put me off, right? You know, it didn't put me off because I'm a cocky bastard, so it didn't. But you know, but I, you know, I think there are people who have been really put off by that on the folk scene. They've, you know, well-meant constructive criticism, but it hasn't landed like that, you know. So, and we might come back to that in a bit. Music sharing recordings. I mean, that's been incredible. Just the journey for me of getting to know all the music. Oh, not all the music because there's so much, but you know, people saying, "Oh, have you heard this?" Particularly in the old days where people give you cassettes. That were, you know, that was great. Knowledge, understanding the history of folk song, and this is where you know, I think the fact that this is a sort of trad song event, I think that's such a huge part of the folk scene, the kind of collective knowledge that we have accumulated And for me, coming into the folk scene with not very much knowledge and that vague sense of, it's just from the mists of time these folk songs come from, and then you gradually over the years sort of get to know where actually it all comes from. And I feel like that's developed a lot in the last 10 years, but I'll come back to that in a bit. Youth spaces, so there were youth spaces, particularly at Sidmouth, as I say. I remember the first time I felt like I was surrounded by a group of people my own age who were into folk song was at Sidmouth in about 2000, 2001. And then the crossover with folk dance, which I had no interest in at all, but very quickly was introduced to quite forcibly by John Spars taking me to Bampton for Whit Monday. It's like, no, you have to come to Whit. You're going to play English folk music. You need to understand Morris dancing. So that was great. So this was just a sort of just jotted this down last night because I thought it was interesting just to think how these things all interact. So, if we've got the origins up there, then we've got the Edwardian revival. And then that, I kind of, it feels like a bit of a grey area for me between the wars. I'm not entirely sure what was going on. There was stuff, but it was kind of underground bubbling, if you know what I mean. And that leads to the 60s folk club boom, which is fed into by American Skiffle. And this then leads to interest in folk dance, which is also from the Edwardian revival. We've got the folk dance boom there. And talking about trad song, it seems to me that the whole academic side of folk song is also a product of the folk revival. And so, in a sense, it comes from that original youth movement. And then with this, this is the social movement. I've sort of put social movements in green. I think was the key. But anyway, it doesn't really show up here anyway. But anyway, so that sort of then turns to professional performance, and then that leads to the folk pop boom. This all sort of feeds into folk festivals and touring circuits and all that sort of thing. My point is, it all kind of it all feeds into each other, basically. That was sort of the point of this, and that's a simpler sort of representation of that. I think all these different aspects, since the 60s revival, have sort of fed on each other. Okay, right. 2025. So I don't really know, about 100 folk clubs, maybe? I'm not sure. I think quite a lot of winding down. And quite a lot have gone. Topic Records not really doing very much. Norris Fellside, Norris Wild Goose. Hudson, there's a mixed picture this. So Hudson Records, who I'm now with, are going very strong, but they're a small company. They've only got so much time. Broadside Hacks, who we're going to talk about in a minute, going very strong. Folk Festival still going strong, but we've lost quite a few. We lost Cambridge this year, although maybe we'll get Cambridge back. We don't know. We've lost Towersey, although they've come back in a different form. But I think it's it's not really a folk festival anymore. Folk Awards totally gone. The folk show's still there, but it's much later. When I was getting going in my career, it was on at 7:00, so you get a huge crossover from 15 years ago, it was from the Simon Mayo show, and they'd even play a folk track into the folk show. So there was this really supportive sort of thing there. Efforts has gone. Not very many broadsheet reviews anymore. So it used to be when you released a CD, you could, if you were lucky enough to sort of be at a certain level, you'd get Times, Guardian, all of them basically. You'd get sort of 6 or 7 reviews from the broadsides, and it wouldn't seem, it's like, Observer, 4 stars. So again, totally took it for granted at the time, and it's just all gone now. There's the Guardian. On the plus side for the younger scene, the Guardian are very much focused on young folk acts, the kind of acts that we're going to talk about in a minute. So I'm sort of loosely calling this the Gen Z proto revival, because this is a group of musicians who are, in the way that I came from outside of the folk scene and then sort of joined the folk scene. They are coming from outside of the folk scene but they're not joining the folk scene, and that's the sort of fundamental difference. It's not quite that simple, but we'll come to that. Okay, so who are they? It's the Goblin Band. Okay, so who are they? They're a 5-piece. They're based in London. Consciously, that was going to be if it had carried on, you would recognise that that's Widdicombe Fair. Consciously unpolished, pretty edgy. Material mostly from revival sources with early music influences. Let's see if this link works.
As back to his own true love, it's gone again. I wish my life was at an end. And nothing spoken is love. And she has told King William all the plan that she might bear her a baby son.
So it's interesting because that's a sort of aesthetic that would not have been out of place in I don't know, 1969, certainly 1972, 1973. That's very much that aesthetic. How did they get into folk music? They did, some of them did grow up with it in the background, but mostly they came to it as adults. Okay, so that's Goblin Band.
Some say that our field was planted and sown, and some say it's savage and wild overgrown. Some claim the great gardener is seen tween the rows, a reaping and a tilling the ground as he goes.
Spitzer Space Telescope. So Seb introduced me to this chap. I was asking Seb about what the sort of the young sort of Gen Z scene is. So he's a mysterious chap called Dan MacDonald, lives in Manchester. So he's signed to Broadside Hacks, which is a London label, very trendy, very young. Also the Goblin Band are signed to Broadside Hacks. Consciously emulating American revival singers. I think you can hear that, can't you? And I don't know how he got into folk music because he's got no. They're quite mysterious. These people. They don't have. They're too cool for websites. So.
It's happened to the Monday morn while seated at me loomses, picking thens from out at yarn. Our nan pops into room, says, who shouted out, I tell thee, Dick, I think thou'rt acting shabby. So off to London, cut this stick and look at Royal Babby.
So, yes, many of you will know Jennifer Reed, much more on the folk scene than the previous two, but doesn't come from the folk scene. She comes from a punk background. She got into folk music. As an organiser, she is organising sort of events very much out of the folk scene. So I think she sort of falls into that same category.
Joy and laughter, mornings after, raise the rafters, we don't care if the roof's beyond repair.
So the Longest Johns you'll be familiar with. Some of you will be anyway. They're a little bit older than the others I'm mentioning, but I think they're quite interesting because, again, they came in from outside of the folk scene. Nothing to do with folk scene at all. Until they got into sea shanties, they're gamers primarily, as I understand it. They play Assassin's Creed, Black Flag, which is sort of a pirate video game thing, and you can. Again, the young people in the room may help me out here, but I think you can sort of drop into the game virtually with an avatar and sort of have conversations, and they would basically do gigs in the game, singing shanties, and that's how they got their following. So they've got this huge following. This is mostly people in their 30s who just go to Longest John's gigs and have no interest in the folk scene outside of that. And they've just got their own scene. It's interesting, they're much closer to the folk scene in terms of presentation. So I actually toured with them. They supported Bellowhead on the last tour, and they work brilliantly because they do a lot of the same sort of stage presentation. They're quite funny, they're quite slick, all that sort of stuff. So they're quite different to those other bands that I've mentioned, but I think they're interesting because they have their own movement that's outside of the folk scene.
The lads in their hundreds to Ludlow come in for the fair. There's men from the barn and the forge and the mill and the fold. The lads for the girls and the lads for the liquor are there. And then...
So again, I've lost Seb's photo, I don't know why, but you can see him, he's here. So Seb's a wonderful singer and uilleann pipe player, unaccompanied English songs. I should have run this by Seb first. Before bringing, I didn't know he was going to be here. But anyway, again, didn't grow up in the folk scene, came into it through school teachers. But I think Seb, again, is very much a foot in different camps. So the folk scene in terms of folk clubs, doing folk clubs with Matt as well. And then the Irish session scene, which is a different social movement, which I haven't really talked about, but I think that's an important thing as well. But then also the Broadside Hack world, so hanging out with the Goblin Band and people like that. So an interesting example of one bit of crossover between the established folk revival scene and this sort of small but potentially quite vibrant new youth scene that's coming up. So there's nothing new about this. People have been coming into the folk scene ever since the 1965, and it's also not unusual for people to come in and be primarily influenced by what was going on in the 60s. That was the case with me in the 2000s. I got into it through listening to early 70s recordings, and all through my career there have been people coming in who have been sort of in a similar aesthetic to the Goblin Band, and who have sort of not fitted in with the folk scene, I think it's fair to say. And what's generally happened though is because the folk scene has had this big gravitational pull, those people have either done what I did, which was go, brilliant, the folk scene, right, I'm now all in, or they've sort of rejected it and pushed away from it and sort of, disappeared from our world. They may still be doing their thing, but basically it's never got any sort of head of steam as a new movement because the folk scene has always been there to sort of welcome them in, but also kind of take the wind out of their sails a bit, potentially. I think that has changed now. I think when we look at that infrastructure that was there in 2001, so much of that is not there anymore. My impression, and I've only met I met the Goblin Band. They came and stayed. I booked them at my club last year, so they came and stayed. So it was nice to hang out with them. And it was just very interesting because it's not like they have any antagonism at all towards our folk scene, if I can be as binary as that. There's no antagonism. They're very respectful of it and interested in it, but they also kind of don't care because it's not what they're doing it for their own thing in the way that it was in the 60s. It's they're putting on events that they want people of their own age and their own sort of outlook to be coming to hang out with, and they're kind of not interested, they're happy for us that we've got this, but they don't kind of need us because that's my impression of it anyway. So I think that gravitational pull has lessened. So it's an interesting moment because whilst there's less that we can sort of offer new people coming into the scene, also there's maybe more freedom for them to do their own thing because our infrastructure is not what it was 20 years ago. So how can we support, given that we can assume we all want folk music to sort of keep going and be around, not least because a lot of us have kids who are into folk music but are part of our world, and what I certainly hope is that my kids in the future will be able to carry on with that but by sort of people coming in as well and forming their own things, and it'd be nice if it all came together at some point. Is basically what I'm saying. These are the things that were supportive of me, so I'm just going through them and comparing it to now. This is with Seb as an example. So a ready-made community of like-minded folk enthusiasts, yes, but with me, it was people my parents' age. With Seb, it's people his grandparents' age. I'm not sure how big a difference that makes, but it is a slight difference. Encouragement and enthusiasm, I think, yes, that's always good. Employment, there's just not, I think it's not as much. I think it's much harder to get folk clubs. I don't think that my experience of just being offered loads of folk club gigs and festival's different, but folk clubs, I think it's not there really. And actually to earn a living, I mean, I've earned a living for the last 20 years primarily from playing art centres. Now I got into the art centres through the folk clubs because we were lucky enough to play enough folk clubs that when an art centre said, "Oh, do you want to come do a gig?" We'd do a gig, and then people who had seen us at the folk clubs would come to the art centres, and then the art centres were like, "Okay, well, we'll keep booking you because you've got," and that's how it worked for me. Without that sort of stepping stone of the supportive stepping stone of the folk club, I don't know that anyone can really get. I don't know how you do it these days, basically, and I don't think they want to either. I don't think they're looking at my gig list and go, "Oh wow, I really wish I was playing at Didcot Art Centre." It's a different vibe for them. They're not really, obviously they like to be paid. They like to be paid like anyone else, but I don't think their ambitions are to emulate, my career or anyone else's career in what we understand to be the folk scene. That's my impression. Record deals, well, they've got the Broadside Hacks, as I say, and that's a very seems to be a very supportive and very cool record label. But CD sales have plummeted. I mean, this is the other thing, is that there's no CDs anymore. I mean, there is for us. It's great for me in this scene because people still buy CDs at gigs, not anywhere else, but at gigs you can still sell CDs. For people in their 20s, I don't know what they sell really. I mean, they sell download, not even download codes because people are just on Spotify. So yeah, that might change. People do buy vinyl now, which is great, and I think the younger bands are selling vinyl, but it's hugely expensive. So if you're playing to a crowd of 20-somethings, are they going to want to spend 30 quid on a record? I don't know. Our performance model, as I say, I don't think they're that interested in learning our sort of model of stagecraft. Really, maybe they are, maybe I don't know, but it doesn't feel. I think they're doing their own thing. That's what I'm saying. They don't need us. Advice again. I think I'm not sure. I think you've got to be very careful before you give anyone advice. As I say, it was all right for me because I was cocky, but I think I'm not sure they want. This sounds very us and them. I don't mean it like that, but it's difficult to talk about it without using us and them. I'm not sure that's what they. I don't think they've invited us to impart our great wisdom to that because they're doing great, and they don't need it. So sharing the enthusiasm with the music, I think that is where we all come together. I think that's where this new scene and our scene comes together. We all love the same music. We're maybe coming in at different points, but that sort of shared love, I think, is really important, and I think we can sort of be supportive in that way. Knowledge. So. Oh, I didn't mention this earlier for me. Oh no, I did mention it for me. But I think knowledge is tremendously important. And I think because this is a Tradstorm event, we're going to talk about this a bit more. I think there's a difference between making knowledge available and giving advice. And I think what is fantastic with the folk scene now is the resources available to anyone wanting to find out more about the history. And also finding repertoire and that sort of thing. I mean, it's incredible. I'm going to talk about that in a bit. Some youth spaces, although even at Sidmouth, so Sidmouth I think is the most sort of noticeable youth space, and it's fantastic. I mean, the LNE at Sidmouth now is just absolutely phenomenal. If you've not seen it recently, it's I've taken my son, and he was up until 3 most nights at Sidmouth this year, you know, just playing tunes, you know, great. Well, I think just playing tunes anyway, don't I? And yes, and there is still this crossover with folk dance, so I feel like that is something that maybe this new scene or this new proto scene doesn't have that crossover with folk dance yet. So we sort of have all this. We have a lot of resources that they might find useful, but they don't necessarily want us to sort of shove it down their throats, I think, maybe. So I think we just need to not assume that what they want is to come into our tent, you know, because I think they've got their own tent. And I think that, and it sounds very like I'm being very negative about the folk scene, and I don't mean to be, because, as I say, it was incredibly supportive to me. But I think their interest is the same interest that the '65 generation had, which was to hang out with people their own age and do their own thing and own their own thing, you know. And I think that's what they want, you know. So what can we do? So I think the availability of objective history is that's so much better now than even 10, certainly 20 years ago. You know, when I started off, and I was like, right, I better actually get my head around all this stuff. So I read about half of Folk Song in England by A.L. Lloyd. Before I noticed there weren't any footnotes or any sources, you know, and it's a brilliant book, but it's largely sort of invented, you know. I think it's fair to say, and then there were books like Fake Song and Imagine Village, but those are very sort of political books. I think it's fair to say they're not really history in the way that I would argue Folk Song in England by Rowden Bishop is a fantastic work of history. I think, you know, it's objective, it's clear, it's informative, it's not got an agenda, you know, and that's such a fantastic resource. And then you add to that, you know, more and more biographies. We've got Sebastien Baring-Gould's biography from Martin. I've just finished the Cecil Sharp biography, which is fantastic. I think that's such an important thing that we as a scene can keep doing. We're doing, you know, and we can keep doing, and just it being available, I think, is the key. I think sessions is because sessions are social, not performative. I think that is a strong crossover point for anyone who's interested in folk music. Keeping our doors open. So I don't think this is about saying that you do your thing, we'll do our thing. I think we can be very welcoming and open. I think we just have to be careful not to intrude on their scene. I'm talking about myself here, because, you know, part of me wants to go down to London and go and hang out with all these cool kids, and you know, going, hi, yes, yeah. And I don't think that's going to help them really. Do you know what I mean? I think maybe a couple of, you know, maybe it was just me, but if I turned up with like 20, if I got a bus trip of all the sort of 48-year-old folkies from Sheffield down, I don't think the Goblin Band want that, you know. That's sort of what I'm saying. Let's keep going. So, but then there is this question of the young generation of sort of our young generation inside the folk scene, who are the same age as these people, and how does that work? And I think that's a really interesting dynamic. And again, I think the Sessions is a really strong crossover point. We've got this wonderful thing in Sheffield now, the Sessions Festival, that's been going for 3 years now. And it's absolutely brilliant for loads of young people. Just turn up to Sheffield because it's free and it's just sessions in the pubs all weekend. And there's this real strong sense of crossover, and it sort of doesn't really matter what scene you've come from, because you're all in the pub and you're all singing songs, you're all playing tunes, whatever. So I think sessions is really important. I think festivals, the interesting thing about festivals is they are also a social thing, you know. So going back to that thing that all comes from social movements, actually the strength of festivals is that people go there for fun and to hang out, And that's, I think, why they continue to be successful and why they continue to bring people in who aren't necessarily that interested in 18th century street ballads. They're interested in the event. So I think festivals is another way that these two, people of the same age but from different backgrounds, but with the same interests, can interact. Also, I get the sense that these scenes are actually they're consciously, their events are all about being welcoming, safe spaces, and so I think they are probably, again, I don't know this, but I feel like they're probably very welcoming to people turning up to their events, particularly of their own age. It's just that I think it's difficult for the people who have grown up in our scene, who have got all this sort of residual knowledge, and then they meet these people of the same age who are into the same thing, but don't know, don't maybe have the same level of knowledge, or maybe the same sort of assumptions about what's good and what's not good, basically, or maybe not the same. There's such a lot of technical. I think a lot of the folk scene since the 60s has been a story of technical development. I think the technical ability of young musicians now is enormous in our scene, because that's what we've done. And I think for those kids, if I can say that, to then meet people who don't have that same technical ability, it's a bit of a culture clash. I don't think it's necessarily a problem, but it is just potentially a sort of a clash. But I'm just going to end really with talking about the importance of the academic backdrop to this all. So so in 1965, Cecil Sharp House had Topic, you had Bert Lloyd, you had all the songbooks, and you had the Folk Music Journal. For me, when I came into it, I had Mudcat. Remember Mudcat? It was still going. But, that it was actually quite early on in internet terms in 2001. There wasn't a lot, which is why I had so many Mondegreens in my early recordings, because I didn't check the lyrics against anything. I just learned them off records, Voice of the People had come out, 40 years of revival recordings. We had Fake Song and Imagine Village, but no Round, as I say. But now we've just got so much more now, and I think this is fantastic, and it means that as this younger generation, whatever they do with it, and it's, as I say, it's kind of it's up to them. I think there's not much we can do really, but they will do what they want to do with it. What we can do is make sure that everything that we've learnt as a scene continues to be available, continues to grow, continues to be there if people want to access it. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. That's a lovely analysis. I think that's very thoughtful, and I think we all appreciate what you put into that, because it's a question we've been asking ourselves.
Speak up, Mark.
Sorry, I'm speaking away from you as well. This is the sort of analysis we wanted. We want to know where things are going to go, and some of us are a bit worried about where they're going. And there's some optimism there that I think is very welcome. Do you want to take any questions?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
If we've got time for a few questions.
Or corrections. Yes.
Is there what's the future for degrees in traditional folk music?
I don't know. I've never really been involved in that side of things. I think in terms of this new Gen Z scene, I don't think it's got any. I don't think there's any interaction really. It feels like the degree thing is very much a part of the revival, and it was great, and it is great. I think I don't know. I know they're all struggling. That's what I know. I mean, all universities are struggling, and I think the folk music degrees are struggling. I feel like it's more naturally a postgrad area of study. That's my instinct of it. So, yeah.
Yeah.
That's what you
on one thing.
Yeah.
I live in London, and sorry. King's Place did amazing things. Samney did a whole curation season at London, as most people probably know. But it's how you folk music is a broad church. So are we talking about the English folk scene, or the Welsh, Scottish, Irish, all diverse? And I think in this generation, maybe that's where there's a potential gap. So you're really focusing on the English, maybe interpreting other cultures, folk scene. I don't know.
As I say, I just think it's a social movement. So it's almost like what material they end up doing, or we end up. It's sort of secondary, I think. You know, I mean, because if you look at the '65 revival. Yes, we went through all that thing of do we only do songs from our own region? Is it acceptable for English people to sing Scottish songs? I don't know is the answer. I mean, I think that's always a question for all performers as to how you respond to music from other cultures, and the whole question of cultural appropriation is a new thing that wasn't really thought about until about maybe 20 years ago, and that's a whole kettle of fish which is quite complicated to navigate.
I'm visiting from America, and I co-founded several folk clubs back in California decades ago. I'm curious about it seems there's a lot of new resources through the internet there. Like I love the contemplated website for fine traditional there. So could you comment on that aspect at all?
Oh, it's phenomenal. I mean, I think so. One thing I haven't mentioned about actually when we're talking about the academic sort of thing is the one gap that I feel there is still there that needs to be filled is actually the history of the revival since the '60s. I feel like that is such an incredibly important bit of history. And that the revival, if it's got a fault, it's that it's slightly undervalued itself as a movement, which is to lead me on to answer your question, which is that for me the best website that's come along in recent years is mainly Norfolk, which is a compilation of revival recordings primarily, and all the sleeve notes. Which is just fantastic. So I mean, I think lots of nods from various performers in the room that it's the first place I go to now if I think maybe I could do this song, mainly Norfolk, and then you see who else has done it, what they said about it, where they got it from, linking back to I think this Steve Gardner's earliest versions is another web resource that I'm always clicking on through mainly Norfolk normally, and the ballad index, and for me that's a brilliant portal.
Yes, can I just say thank you so much for such a stimulating talk, and I wanted to pay. I just wanted to remember Miss Richardson and Mr. Sowerby from my Summerside Junior School in the 1950s in Finchley, North London.
Right.
Because that's what set me on my journey. It's got me here today in all sorts of ways. But we're living in a completely different world. You didn't actually mention COVID, but it's changed our lives, how we live now. And I know from my niece in her 30s and her wife, and gaming, the whole lifestyle of young people now is weird to me. I'm coping with getting to grips with it, and I don't think life will ever be the same. And I think there are so many implications for folk music, for festivals, for how we meet each other. And I wondered if you could say a little bit about that, because you're experiencing that all the time.
I feel quite positive about that, because I feel that all of these weird things like AI and and COVID and all these social movements that are sort of pushing us away from each other in a sense, in terms of physically being together. Actually, I feel like there is already a reaction against that, and that what people are craving is getting into a bar room with a bunch of people, maybe their own age, maybe a range of ages, and singing songs, and and so I actually feel quite positive that I think that always comes back. As weird as things might get in other ways, it's just sceptical, but I think there is always a desire for human contact, and I think that always wins out. Right, can I take one from Brian? Yeah. I'll say, because talking about the clarity of the academic world at the moment, and I think there's such a lot of negative stuff about Sharp, and it was great to see your abridged article in the last EDS, because I think it's so difficult when a bit of dodgy history gets out there, and it's really important to sort of put those things clear. Anyway, so yes, question, Brian.
Thanks for that. I have actually also published stuff on the history of the folk revival, and that's
right.
where I'm going with this.
Okay, right.
Because you identified the revival of the 60s as a social movement, but I think it was also a very political movement.
Right.
Both with a big P, in that a number of the leading lights were socialists or Marxists of various persuasions, but also with a small P, partly in the sense of the repertoire that Bert Lloyd kind of curated and directed to those young people, but also what you've just touched on in your last answer, which was the fact that this is music that we make for ourselves, and it's not being imposed on us from above. So there was this very conscious rejection of commercialism.
Yeah.
So I think in a way you've already started to answer.
Left wing, but in a left wing, a type of left wing that is maybe not quite the same as the left wing in the 60s. But again, I just think politics often comes from social movements as well. I think which is not to disagree with your point, but I think I come back to the fact that people want to hang out with each other and have fun, and I think the politics and the music in a way comes into that space rather than sometimes you're drawn to a space because of the politics or because of the music, but I feel like when it goes big, it's because it's actually the social thing first, and that's that. But yeah, I think the politics thing is always actually, it wasn't very important when I came in. That was sort of unusual, I suppose, in the noughties. Pretty much no politics.
I remember Tony Rose standing in front of an audience in the 1980s and saying Margaret Thatcher is the best thing that happened to the folk scene because we've all got fired.
Well, I remember being told off for not being political enough in the noughties, so that's the other side of it. And I said, well, I'm singing an 18th century folk song. What do you want me to do? Anyway, but yeah.
Just one more question.
One more question.
I think you.
Yeah, I'm an American, but I live half time in Scotland, and I felt this ties in nicely with the previous question. I'm somewhere between Mark McCarthy's generation and yours.
Yeah.
And I came into folk scene totally from politics. I fell in love with Dick Gaughan's music, which led me to Leon Russellson, which led me to Frankie Armstrong, and that was my entry into English traditional music.
Right.
Was she was singing English traditional songs that had a women's focus to them.
Yeah.
And so I just wondered, does that kind of pathway still exist?
Honestly, I think it's quite problematic for the younger generation because they're very much more focused on. Put it this way, there are a lot of folk songs that they would not be comfortable singing for various reasons that we wouldn't have felt uncomfortable about. I think they are less. If I have a criticism of that, it's not really a criticism; it's more an observation. But that generation are less used to seeing things in a historical context and sort of saying that's what it was, So I think it's difficult. I think there is a lot more of an impetus for younger folk singers to rewrite stuff to sort of fit with more their worldview, which is completely understandable. But it's certainly not where I sort of came from or stand now. Even I've always had a historical interest above a sort of listening.
Thanks very much. Thanks, John. That was wonderful. Roy Palmer was a remarkable folklorist, and his many publications about folk song and about the history and folklore of the Midlands gave us all increased knowledge about these things. And he gave that knowledge freely to many singers and researchers. And I'm far from alone in having benefited from his advice and his publications. So, after his death, I conceived the idea of a lecture series in his name that would give a platform to people from the field of folk song and folklore, like Jon and those who've been here before him, to share their knowledge and thoughts with others. So I put aside funding for a 10-year series. We started with a talk by Steve Roud in 2016. We went online during COVID and then found this new home at Whitby Folk Week in 2022. I'm grateful for the support we've received from Whitby Folk Week, from the Traditional Song Forum and the Folklore Society and Doc Rowe over the last years, all of whom have helped make this happen. The funding actually ran out a couple of years ago, inevitably. And this, the 10th lecture, will, as planned, be the last under the current arrangements. It's possible that a way may be found to continue, and I have had some discussions about this, but the lectures from 2025 onwards can be viewed on YouTube, and I'll continue to manage the Roy Palmer Lecture website. I'd like to believe that the lecture series has been a success and that Roy would have approved. I hope you've enjoyed today's talk as much as I did, and that if you weren't there for the ones beforehand, that you'll go back and have a look at the archive. So thank you very much for coming today. Thank you once again to Jon, and have a great rest.